It started with a mundane family dinner, a routine affair my husband insisted we attend. His family was close-knit and I was always included, though I often felt like an outsider. That evening the air was thick with laughter and the aroma of roasted chicken. Yet I found myself distracted, the conversation blurring into a monotonous hum. And then he entered the room. My husband's stepfather. His presence was commanding in an unassuming way. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. A simple glance, a brief smile, and the room seemed to shift around him. I noticed how his shoulders squared confidently, how his laughter rumbled low and rich. Something about him struck me that night, though I couldn't quite place it then. Our eyes met for the first time when he poured wine into my glass. It was brief, innocent even, but I felt a flicker like a match being struck in a dimly lit room. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. After all, he was just being polite, wasn't he? As the evening progressed, I watched him out of the corner of my eye. My husband was at the far end of the table, engrossed in a debate about sports. Meanwhile, his stepfather sat close enough that I could feel the heat of his arm when he leaned forward to refill his own glass. "Do you enjoy these gatherings?" he asked suddenly, his tone low, meant only for me. I hesitated, caught off guard. "They're lively," I replied, a safe answer. His lips curved into a knowing smile. "Lively isn't always enjoyable though, is it?" Something about the way he spoke felt charged, as if he understood more than I'd said. Before I could respond, someone called his name, breaking the moment. That night, as I lay beside my husband in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. My husband's soft snores filled the room, a sound I'd once found comforting but now only irritated me. My mind wandered back to the way his stepfather's voice seemed to linger in the air, how his presence had awakened a restlessness I hadn't known was there. For years I'd convinced myself that my marriage was enough. My husband was kind, dependable, and provided me with the stability I craved after a chaotic youth. But lately something felt missing. A spark, an intensity one couldn't quite name. That night I realized I'd been starving for connection, for someone to see me beyond the roles I played. Wife, daughter-in-law, hostess. I told myself it was just a passing thought, a harmless intrigue. Yet, as the days went by, I found myself replaying our brief exchanges, imagining how the conversation might have gone if it hadn't been interrupted. I even lingered on thoughts of his smile, the faint lines that framed it, evidence of a life lived with wisdom and perhaps regret. By the end of the week I found myself hoping, no yearning, for another encounter. I hadn't felt this alive in years. A few days later I was heading to my favorite cafe downtown. I needed a break, a place where I could sit alone with my thoughts. The familiar chime of the bell above the door greeted me as I walked in. The comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. I placed my order, found a quiet corner table and pulled out my notebook, pretending to be preoccupied. But my mind kept wandering back to that dinner. To him. His voice, his steady gaze. It was all still so vivid, like an imprint I couldn't erase. Then I heard a familiar voice. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up and there he was. I froze for a moment, feeling my pulse quicken. "Sure," I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. He settled into the chair across from me with an ease that felt oddly intimate. "I didn't expect to see you here," he remarked, his tone casual but his eyes searching mine. "I come here when I need to clear my head," I replied, my voice softer than usual. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table. "Something weighing on your mind?" The question caught me off guard. It was direct, too direct. "Isn't there always?" I responded with a nervous laugh, trying to deflect. His gaze didn't waver. "You seem distant. Even at the dinner." I looked down at my coffee cup, tracing the rim with my finger. "I guess I've been feeling off lately." It was the most honest thing I'd said in days. Silence settled between us, but it wasn't awkward. It felt like a pause in a familiar conversation. "Marriage can feel like that sometimes," he said finally, his voice low and knowing. I looked up sharply, but he wasn't mocking me. There was no judgment in his expression, only understanding. It felt like he could see straight through the layers of pretense I carried. "Is that how it felt for you?" I asked before I could stop myself. He exhaled, a quiet, almost wistful sound. "At times, yes. We build a life expecting it to be enough. Until one day we realize we've forgotten how to feel alive." His words hung between us, heavy with meaning. My heart thudded in my chest. There was something dangerous about the honesty in this moment, but I couldn't look away. "Do you regret it?" I asked. "Only the things I didn't do," he answered. His eyes locked with mine, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside the cafe had disappeared. When the waitress brought our food, the spell broke for a moment. We shifted in our seats, pretending this was just a casual coffee between two acquaintances. But we both knew it wasn't. He reached for his drink, and as his hand brushed past mine, I felt a shiver down my spine. His touch was brief, accidental, but it left a lingering heat. I withdrew my hand quickly, but the sensation remained. "You shouldn't look so serious all the time," he said, a teasing smile breaking the tension. I managed a small smile back. "And you shouldn't be so observant. Occupational hazard," he replied with a shrug. As the minutes passed, our conversation drifted to safer topics: work, family. But beneath every word was an undercurrent of unspoken tension. I found myself laughing at his dry humor, noticing the way his eyes crinkled at the edges when he smiled. When it was time to leave, he stood and reached for his coat. I followed suit, feeling the weight of what had passed between us. As we stood near the door, he hesitated. "It's good to talk like this," he said, his voice softer now. "It is," I agreed, my heart pounding. Then, before I could process it, his hand brushed my cheek. A fleeting touch, but deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I left the cafe in a daze, the cold air biting at my skin. I walked slowly, trying to steady my thoughts, but my mind was a blur. That simple touch had ignited something in me that I couldn't ignore. At home, my husband greeted me with a tired smile and a kiss on the forehead. The familiarity of it should have been comforting, but instead it felt hollow. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized the truth. I wasn't just restless. I was seeking something that had been missing for years. And now, I knew exactly where I wanted to find it. The days that followed felt like a haze. Every routine moment, cooking breakfast, folding laundry, watching television with my husband, seemed muted, like I was living on autopilot. I answered his questions, smiled at the right times, and played the role of the devoted wife. But beneath the surface, my thoughts were elsewhere. I was replaying that brief touch at the cafe, the weight of his gaze, and the way his words had burrowed deep inside me. I was desperate to feel that spark again. I told myself it was harmless, that I just needed clarity. Yet even as I repeated those excuses, I knew I was lying to myself. It was mid-morning when I found myself sitting in my car outside the park where I knew he liked to take walks. The late autumn air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I stepped onto the path. I didn't call or text him. I couldn't bring myself to be that bold. Instead, I let fate take control. And there he was. He was standing near the water's edge, hands in his coat pockets, staring out at the rippling surface. His breath fogged in the cool air. For a brief second, I considered turning back, but he turned just as I hesitated, and our eyes locked. "You found my hiding spot," he said with a wry smile. I shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Maybe I needed a hiding spot too." He studied me for a long moment before nodding toward the bench nearby. "Walk with me." I nodded, falling into step beside him. The silence between us felt heavy but not uncomfortable. After a few minutes, he broke the silence. "What are you running from?" The question cut deeper than I expected. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling vulnerable. "I don't know," I admitted. "Everything. Nothing. I just feel lost." He stopped walking and turned to face me. His expression softened, and for the first time I felt like he truly saw me, saw all the pieces I tried so hard to keep together. "It's okay to feel that way," he said gently. "No one else seems to think so," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of it all. "Everyone expects me to be fine, to be happy. But I don't know if I am." His gaze held mine, steady and unwavering. "You don't have to be fine all the time." A gust of wind blew past us, and I shivered slightly. Without a word, he slid his coat off and draped it over my shoulders. His warmth surrounded me, and my breath caught as I felt his fingers brush against my collarbone. The contact was brief, yet it sent a ripple through me like a spark catching dry leaves. "You're not alone," he said softly. I don't know what came over me in that moment. Maybe it was the weight of everything I'd kept inside for so long, or maybe it was the way he looked at me like I was someone worth understanding. All I knew was that I couldn't fight it anymore. I took a step closer, and before I could second-guess myself, I kissed him. It wasn't planned or careful. It was raw, impulsive, and filled with everything I'd been holding back. His hands slid to my waist, steadying me as if he'd been waiting for this as long as I had. For one fleeting moment, the noise of the world disappeared, leaving only the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. When we pulled apart, I was breathless. My cheeks burned, whether from the cold or from shame I wasn't sure. "I shouldn't have," I began, but he shook his head. "You don't need to explain." His voice was calm, but his eyes searched mine as if he was trying to figure out if I regretted it. We stood there in silence, the moment hanging between us like a fragile thread. Finally, he took a step back, giving me space I wasn't sure I wanted. "Take your time," he said quietly. "But don't lie to yourself about what you want." I nodded, unable to speak. I turned and walked away, still wrapped in his coat, my heart pounding against my ribs. When I got home, my husband was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels. He glanced up at me, smiling. "You're back early. Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah. I just needed some air." He nodded, distracted by the TV again, unaware of the storm raging inside me. That night, I lay in bed, staring into the darkness. His coat still hung in the corner of the room, a reminder of everything I couldn't deny anymore. I didn't feel lost anymore. I felt found. But at what cost? I never thought an ordinary family night could shift something inside me. It was supposed to be simple. A cozy evening with popcorn, laughter, and an old action movie playing on the screen. One of those dated films where the heroes were always tumbling down staircases or throwing punches like their lives depended on it. The three of us, me, my husband, and his stepfather, sat together, immersed in the familiar chaos of flying fists and dramatic slow-motion stunts. I should have been relaxed. Instead, I was hyper-aware of the way the couch dipped slightly under his weight whenever he shifted. Then, as the credits rolled over the final scene, his stepfather stood up suddenly, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "You know," he began, his voice carrying that calm authority I'd grown used to, "people always forget how to fall properly." I raised an eyebrow. "Fall properly?" He laughed, that deep, rumbling sound that made his presence seem even larger. "Yes, to avoid injury. Here, let me show you." I should have declined. I should have brushed it off as a joke. But instead I found myself nodding. He stood tall, bracing himself like an athlete preparing for a demonstration. "First you find your balance." He shifted his feet apart, then glanced at me. "You're not afraid of a few quick moves, are you?" I narrowed my eyes, playing along. "Not at all." His grin widened. "Good. Because here's the trick." Before I could react, he made a playful motion as if to push me toward the couch. I stumbled back, letting out a startled laugh, and toppled onto the soft cushions. I couldn't stop giggling, the ridiculousness of the scene hitting me all at once. "That's your big safety demonstration?" He chuckled and reached out his hand to help me up. "Only part one." I took his hand, still grinning. But as I tried to pull myself up, he lost his footing and, in a clumsy twist, landed beside me on the couch with a muffled thump. The look of shock on his face was priceless, and I burst into uncontrollable laughter. For a few seconds, we were just two people caught in the absurdity of the moment. No pretense, no hidden meanings, just laughter. When we finally regained our composure, he leaned back, his breath still uneven from laughing. "Well," he said, running a hand through his hair, "clearly I'm not cut out for safety demonstrations." I shook my head, wiping a tear from my eye. "That was ridiculous." He nodded, his gaze softening. "Ridiculous. But fun." And he was right, it was fun. For the first time in a long while, I felt lighter, unburdened by expectations or routine. Our laughter filled the room in a way that made it feel warmer, more alive. Later that night, when we'd all settled back into the couch, my husband dozed off, his head tilted back against the cushion. I stole a glance at his stepfather. He caught my eye and gave me a small, knowing smile. It wasn't flirtatious or suggestive, just something quiet and understanding, like an unspoken acknowledgement of the moment we'd shared. But it wasn't just that one moment. After that night, our evenings in front of the TV felt different. We had a new inside joke about my terrible balance and his guru instincts. But underneath the jokes, I could feel something else, a warmth that hadn't been there before. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't anything, yet. But it was honest. And it was dangerous. As I climbed into bed next to my husband that night, I replayed the scene over and over in my mind. His laugh, his touch, the ease with which we'd both let our guards down. What scared me wasn't the awkward fall or even the laughter. It was how comfortable it felt. And sometimes I thought as I stared at the ceiling, the most innocent moments could become the most unforgettable. The small cracks they created in our lives were the ones that eventually broke us wide open. After that night, something shifted between us. Our conversations became easier, filled with subtle humor and lingering glances. My husband didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in work, his tired routine keeping him distracted. But I noticed everything. The following weekend we gathered again in the living room. Another old movie flickered across the screen. A Western this time. My husband sprawled comfortably on the couch, oblivious, while his stepfather and I exchanged small smiles over shared jokes. Midway through the film, I excused myself to the kitchen, craving a moment alone to gather my thoughts. I was pouring water into a glass when I heard his voice behind me. Distracted? I jumped slightly, nearly spilling the water. You really need to stop sneaking up on me. He chuckled. I wasn't sneaking. You just weren't paying attention. I turned around and there he was, closer than I'd expected. The dim light from the stove illuminated the silver in his hair, highlighting the quiet confidence that always seemed to follow him. My breath caught for a second. You've seemed distant today, he said, his tone softer now. I hesitated. The kitchen felt too small, the space between us shrinking with every heartbeat. I've had a lot on my mind, I admitted. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Want to talk about it? I shook my head, forcing a smile. You wouldn't understand. He raised an eyebrow. Try me. I wasn't sure why I said it. Maybe I just needed someone to hear me. Do you ever feel like you're standing still while everything around you moves on without you? My voice was barely a whisper, but I knew he'd heard. His expression softened and he nodded slowly. More than you know. Something in the way he said it made my chest tighten. His honesty felt like a lifeline in the middle of a storm I couldn't navigate alone. I don't know what's wrong with me, I whispered. I have everything I thought I wanted, but I still feel empty. He didn't try to offer empty reassurances or cliches. He simply reached out and rested his hand over mine on the counter. The warmth of his touch spread through me like fire, and I felt myself lean in before I could stop. I see you, he said quietly. Even if no one else does. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle. When I opened them, I found myself impossibly close to him. I could hear his steady breathing, feel the tension in the air like a taut string about to snap. I shouldn't be here, I said, but the conviction in my voice was weak, wavering. You're exactly where you want to be, he replied, his voice low. And then it happened, he kissed me. It wasn't rushed or reckless. It was slow, deliberate, and unspoken words poured into that one touch. My heart raced, not from fear but from the sheer gravity of it. For a moment time stood still. His hands rested lightly at my waist, grounding me as if he was afraid I might break. But I didn't pull away. I leaned into him, let the kiss deepen, let myself feel everything I'd been trying to suppress. The sound of the refrigerator humming, the faint echo of the TV in the other room, it all faded. There was only him, only this moment. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless. His gaze searched mine, looking for regret that wasn't there. We can't do this, I said, though I barely believed my own words. I know, he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from my face. But here we are. I stepped back, the cold air hitting me like a splash of water. I need to get back before he notices. He nodded, understanding without me having to explain. I slipped past him, my pulse still racing, and re-entered the living room, taking my place next to my husband as if nothing had happened. My husband turned to me, oblivious, and offered me some popcorn. I forced a smile, trying to calm the storm inside me. But as I sat there, feeling the warmth of his hand briefly brush against mine, I knew everything had changed. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I knew there was no turning back. The days after the kiss felt surreal. I floated between guilt and an unshakable sense of exhilaration. I'd replayed every second of that moment in the kitchen, how his touch had ignited something that had been dormant for so long. Yet even as I stood by my husband's side, part of me was elsewhere. But there's a funny thing about desire. It doesn't just dissipate. It grows, feeding off silence, off unspoken words and stolen glances. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. The following week, my husband had to leave for a work conference in another city. As he packed his suitcase, I sat on the edge of the bed watching his methodical movements. Shirts folded neatly, socks rolled with precision. Everything about him was so predictable, so perfectly measured. He glanced up and smiled. "You'll be okay here alone?" I nodded. "Of course. It's only a few days." He leaned down to kiss me, his lips brushing my cheek rather than my mouth. I closed my eyes, pretending that I didn't notice the distance. "I'll call you when I get there," he said. The door closed behind him, and for the first time in weeks, the house was silent. No hum of his voice from the other room, no rustling of papers. Just me, alone with my thoughts. But I wasn't alone for long. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from him. "You free today?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. 1,000 thoughts flashed through my mind. Reasons to say no, reasons to stay away. But my fingers moved on their own. Yes. He picked me up an hour later. When I slid into the passenger seat, the air between us was thick with tension. Neither of us spoke as he drove. The silence wasn't awkward. It was charged, like the quiet before a storm. We ended up on the outskirts of the city, where the streets were quieter, the world less intrusive. He parked the car near an old botanical garden, and for a moment neither of us moved. "We don't have to do this," he said, though his voice was laced with conflict rather than conviction. I turned to him, my gaze steady. "But we want to." He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "You deserve more than this," he whispered. I leaned forward, resting my hand over his on the steering wheel. "Then give me more." The next thing I knew, we were out of the car, standing beneath the arch of ivy that framed the entrance to the garden. The air smelled faintly of pine and wet leaves, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the path. He reached for my hand and I let him. It wasn't just a touch. It was an unspoken promise. We walked deeper into the garden, hidden from the world by walls of greenery. When we stopped, he turned toward me, his expression torn between restraint and surrender. "You have no idea how hard I've tried to stay away," he murmured. My pulse quickened. "Then stop trying." His hands cupped my face and he kissed me again, deeper this time, with all the emotions we'd kept locked away. I felt the roughness of his stubble against my skin, the warmth of his breath as our foreheads pressed together for a brief second. My hands found his collar, clutching it as if I could hold on to this moment forever. There was no hesitation now, no doubt. For the first time, I let myself feel everything. The fear, the longing, the recklessness. I embraced it all. When the kiss broke, I felt lightheaded. He rested his forehead against mine, both of us catching our breath. "We can't stay here," he whispered, though neither of us made a move to leave. "I don't care," I whispered back. "Not right now." We lingered for what felt like hours but was probably just minutes. Time blurred when I was with him. Reality bent to the weight of everything we felt. When we finally returned to the car, the silence was softer now, no longer filled with questions or doubt. He reached for my hand again as he drove, his thumb brushing gentle circles over my skin. By the time he pulled up in front of my house, the sky was streaked with pink and gold. I didn't want to get out of the car. Leaving felt like waking up from a dream I didn't want to end. "I'll see you soon?" he asked, his voice hesitant for the first time. I nodded. "Yes." He smiled, soft, almost sad, and I felt my heart tighten. I stepped out of the car, and as I watched him drive away, I knew there was no going back. When I stepped inside, the house felt colder than before. My husband's suitcase was still gone, his scent faint in the air. I sank onto the couch, my fingers brushing my lips as if I could still feel his kiss. For the first time, I let myself admit the truth. I didn't want to stop. Even if it meant shattering everything I'd built. The night my husband returned home, I waited by the front door, rehearsing how I would greet him. I wanted everything to seem normal, even though it felt like my entire life had shifted on its axis. The weight of the past few days hung on me like a heavy coat I couldn't shrug off. The door opened and he stepped inside, dropping his suitcase by the wall. His eyes lit up when he saw me. "Missed me?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me in a familiar embrace. I let myself melt into his touch, trying to remember what this was supposed to feel like. His scent, clean linen and cedarwood, was the same. His heartbeat, steady and slow, was the same. But I wasn't the same. "Of course," I whispered, forcing the words through the lump in my throat. That evening we sat together on the couch, another old movie playing in the background. He stretched his arm along the back of the sofa, resting his hand near my shoulder. I leaned in, pretending to enjoy the warmth, but my mind was elsewhere, lost in fragments of memories that weren't his. The sound of laughter and gunfire on the screen felt distant. I smiled when he smiled, nodded when he spoke. But when he leaned down to kiss me, something inside me recoiled. His touch felt foreign now, and the realization crushed me. He pulled back, his brow furrowed. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated. "I'm just tired." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You've been distant lately," he said quietly. "I feel like you're slipping away." My heart sank. He wasn't wrong. But I couldn't bring myself to give him the truth, not the whole of it. "It's just life," I whispered. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not enough." His face softened and he reached for my hand. "You are. You've always been enough." The words should have reassured me. Instead they stung. Because the truth was, I wasn't enough for myself. The next morning I woke early, unable to sleep. I padded into the kitchen and made a cup of tea, staring out the window as the first rays of dawn stretched across the horizon. My phone sat on the counter, silent and still, but I felt its pull. I wanted to call him, needed to hear his voice, but I didn't. Instead, I let the minutes stretch out, trying to make sense of the mess I'd created. By the time my husband woke up, I'd already made breakfast. Pancakes, bacon, the works. I was trying too hard and we both knew it. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, standing behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. "I wanted to." He kissed my shoulder, his touch gentle but distant, like he was trying to find his way back to me. I wished I could meet him halfway, but my heart was somewhere else. Later that afternoon, as I folded laundry, the doorbell rang. My pulse quickened as I walked toward it. When I opened the door, my breath caught. It was him. I stepped outside quickly, closing the door behind me. "What are you doing here?" I whispered, panic rising in my chest. He ran a hand through his hair, looking as conflicted as I felt. I couldn't stay away. My resolve wavered. "You can't be here." "I know." He stepped closer, his voice breaking. "But I'm losing my mind without you." The honesty in his words shattered the last of my defenses. I looked back at the house, at the life I'd built, and then at him. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "You don't have to know everything right now. But you have to be honest with yourself." Tears welled in my eyes. I was standing on the edge of a choice that could break everything apart. If I go down this path, there's no fixing it. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to choose what makes you happy." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. Inside the house, my husband called my name, his voice distant but familiar. The choice loomed before me: comfort or chaos, security or passion. I squeezed his hand once before letting go. "I can't do this." His expression crumbled, but he nodded. "I understand." He turned and walked away, his silhouette fading down the street. I watched until he disappeared, feeling the sharp ache of loss. When I went back inside, my husband was standing in the hallway, confusion on his face. "Who was that?" "No one," I lied, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. He frowned but let it go. I walked past him, pretending everything was fine, but I knew the truth. I'd made my choice. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the stillness settle over me. The house was quiet, the familiar hum of life continuing on. But I knew that some doors once opened could never be fully closed. I hadn't chosen him, but I hadn't really chosen my husband either. I'd chosen to live with the weight of what could have been. And some part of me knew that weight would never truly leave.